Today we are looking at the AMD R9 270X GPU to see if it's any good in 2021. On with the show. We are using a suite of benchmarks and games to try and evaluate the GPU and put it through its paces. So on we go. Starting off in super precision at 1080p, with high settings and we see an average of 28 FPS, whereas at the low settings we see 65 FPS, which is an increase of 132%, while at 720p the high settings the FPS average is 45. Not a huge increase considering we're using a lower resolution, but it's still 61% extra performance. Loading the settings returns an average of 88 FPS, again not a huge improvement over the higher resolution, seeing a modest 36% increase. The difference between the high settings over the low at 720p is 43%, which is 96% increase. Looking at time spy now, when running the benchmark at a rendered resolution of 1440p, we see a very low FPS. 11 and a graphics score of 1783, while at 1080p the FPS is 17 and a graphics score of 2658. Even when using 720p the results are not any better with 26 FPS and a score of 1494. iStrike Extreme sees a better result though. At 1440p the FPS is still very low at 14 and a score of 3165. 1080p and 720p fare better with 25 FPS and 41 FPS respectively, and scores of 5520 and 8852. Night Raid sees a far better result with 1440p, coming in at 42 FPS, at 1080p it's 125 FPS, and at 720p it is 200 FPS. The graphics scores come in at 8462, 25541 and 4873 respectively. Moving over to the games portion of the tests, starting with CSGO. 1080p with the high settings we see an average of 81 FPS, while at 720p the return is 168. 108% increase with the lower resolution, CSGO can run on most graphic cards quite well, even if the settings have to be lowered. Rocket League proves the point that esports titles are easier to run with an average of 220 FPS at a high setting at 1080p, and 253 FPS at 720p, only a small increase of 15%. So running at 1080p will be the better option to play with in my opinion. GTA 5 plays quite well too at 1080p with the high settings, seeing 58 FPS on average and 92 FPS at 720p. An increase of 59% at the lower resolution. Again though, I would stay at 1080p, and if the 58 FPS isn't doing it for you then you need to lower the settings and that should help. Dirt 4 now running with the ultra settings at 1080p. These are 23 FPS average, while the high settings show an improvement coming in at 50 FPS. And the low settings see a tiny increase at 54 FPS. This sees differences of 117% when going from ultra settings down to high, but only an 8% increase from the high settings down to low. Staying at high settings seems to be the sweet spot. Going over to 720p, we see 39 FPS at ultra, 71 FPS at high and 98 FPS at low. So at 720p there are bigger differences than at 1080p, which sees an 82% increase when going from ultra settings down to high, and 38% increase when going down from high settings to low. This time, the low settings at 720p win out over the other two settings. Unreal Tournament now at 1080p. With epic settings sees an average of 54, while high settings sees 69 on average, and medium sees an average of 88. This sees differences of 28% from epic settings down to high, and the same again from high down to medium settings, so quite consistent. At 720p with epic settings sees 93 FPS, while high comes in at 115 FPS, and medium is at a high of 200 FPS. This sees differences of 24 from epic settings down to high, and a 74% increase from high down to medium settings. Again, personally I feel 1080p is the sweet spot, but your mileage may vary. Apex Legends now sees the high settings at 1080p come in at 43 FPS, while medium is at 49, but low suffers a bit going down to 47 FPS. Not much lower considering the settings difference, the gap should be bigger. Overall though, at 1080p we see a very close result. Going over to 720p at high settings sees a return of 67 FPS, while at medium it's at 72. Again a small increase, but at the low settings the gap is bigger at 94 FPS, which is a 35% increase. So Apex Legends is playable, just doesn't have an high FPS count. Control now, and this proved to be very difficult for this GPU to run. At 1080p with the high settings we see a really bad average of 13, while at medium settings it was 32. At 1080p with low settings we come in at a 55 FPS average. At 720p we see similar results with high settings at 25 FPS, medium at 93 FPS, and low settings at 102. So when you look at the results for each setting at 722, the outcome is nearly double that of 1080p. However, like I say, it struggles with this one. Another esports title now, Fortnite, 1080p with high settings. We have an average of 48 FPS, while at medium we see 118 FPS. At low it's 171. This equates to differences of 146% and 45% respectively. 720p, you'll see at high settings the average FPS is at 75, and at medium it's 116, and at low it's 157. And this is where things start to get strange. For many hours trying to improve the 720p scores and failing, I decided to do a little bit of reading up. And from what I can gather, the poor performance at 720p is down to either a poorly written driver or games not well enough optimised to support the 720p resolution. And in fairness, that's fine. 720p isn't really a thing anymore, unless you're playing really old retro titles. So it could explain the issues we're having with this particular game. World of Warships now, and I know it isn't a fast paced game, but it can look quite pretty. So at 1080p with the very high settings, we see an average of 83 FPS. But medium and very low come in at 76 and 75 FPS. At 720p using the very high settings we see a result of 75. And both medium and low tied again, but with much bigger FPS over the high setting, coming in at 118 FPS each. Forza Horizon 4 sees an underwhelming result with 1080p at high settings coming in at 34. Medium settings was at 40 and low was at 58. Meanwhile 720p at high sees 44 FPS, medium settings see at 47 FPS, and low settings is at 61. So this is another game where running at 1080p is just a better experience. But if you want to get your FPS up, you really need to use the low settings. It still looks good anyway at that, with low settings anyway. Onto Crysis now at 1080p with the very high settings we see 67 FPS on average, high settings is at 95, and medium is at 100 FPS on average. This sees differences of 42% and only 5% respectively. When we try 720p with very high settings, we see 94 FPS on average. With just high settings we see 129, but when we go down to medium we see a drop of 6 FPS down to 123 FPS. This sees an increase of 37% going from very high settings down to high, but only a 5% drop, but a 5% drop when going from high settings down to medium. And finally on to Battlefield 5, at 1080p with high settings switched on, we see 40 FPS on average, mediums at 58 and at low it's 75. This is a 45% and 29% increase in FPS when switching up the modes. At 720p with high settings we see 68 FPS, medium settings it's 83 and at low it's 88. So this comes out at a difference of 22% and 6% increase respectively. Battlefield 5 can be played at a reasonable resolution with lower settings on this card. So what does all this mean? All these numbers? Is the 270X any good in 2021? Well, the short answer is no, of course it's not. However, everything's relative. And what I mean to say is that if you have this GPU and you can't afford to upgrade yet, for all the reasons we know why, you will have an okay time playing certain titles like the one shown here, except for Control. But new AAA titles like Cyberpunk won't work, maxed out to the lack of VRAM. If all you play is esports titles or turn-based games and older titles, then this GPU will be fine. But there you go, my official verdict is meh. It's okay, not going to set the world on fire, but it will still let you play games. Coming soon is the GTX 980 and the GTX 1070, so make sure you're subscribed to see them. Leave a like or any comments down below, and I will see you in the next one.